What about now? Can you hear me now? Bueller, Bueller. Somebody say yes. Somebody tell me, yes, you can hear me. Praying for the best, you guys? Yes, there we go. All right. Well, what I was telling you is that I had a freaking amazing time last week at the beach. I did not get eaten by a shark, even though we were right there on the beach with the sharks. As we were driving down, I was getting text messages from friends saying, "Do you know that there's sharks being sighted?" And there was 2 shark attacks. And I'm like, freaking great. We did see a couple, but we didn't get bit by any. And that's all really and truly that matters. I appreciate you guys tuning in with me tonight and being patient. Thank you for helping me through my technical difficulties. Drop in the comments where you guys are tuning in from. It's always so exciting to know where you are, where you're listening from. And as always, please join in on the conversation. If you have questions or thoughts, things like that, jump in. It makes this so much more enjoyable. And I feel like it really helps everybody learn a little bit more as we go through the process. You don't want to just sit here and listen to me talk the whole time. If you have a question, it's kind of like in school, probably somebody else does too. So let's jump over in the chat. Yes, there we go. Good. I just died of laughter. Don't die on me. You got to be part of this. So glad everyone was safe and had a good trip. It was freaking fantastic. So we're going to roll with it. So, you guys, one of the things that I keep hearing, especially kind of end of 2022 through 2023 and into 2024 for sure, is that this economy that we're going through right now, especially the housing market, very much mirrors the 80s. Now, for me in the 80s, I was born, but I definitely wasn't buying houses at that time. So I'm kind of looking back at my mom and my grandparents, looking at what they went through and looking at just history from, the stats that we know and looking at what's going on right now. And one of the things that I continue to hear, besides the fact that we just are mirroring the 80s, is a lot of people that are buying homes right now, mostly millennials, obviously, are saying that, boomers just had it so much easier when they were buying a home, that homes were so much more affordable. And so, of course, they were able to get into their first home earlier in life because it was just such a more affordable time. But is that really and truly the case? I had to kind of dig through some numbers, and there was definitely some interesting things that I found in researching this because I found this article that said boomers did not have it easy at all. And obviously, I think I've gone over on this channel before looking at interest rates over the years. The 80s were some of the highest numbers. So let's really dive in and take a look at what we're talking about here. So it said, no, boomers didn't have it easier than millennials when buying their first homes. So amid rampant inflation, home prices had shot up more than 60% in 4 years, and mortgage rates surged to their highest level in recent memory. No, these young prospective buyers weren't millennials. These were the boomers. These were the baby boomers. And the year was 1980 when mortgage rates topped 16% and the average home loan payment jumped 34% from a year earlier. You guys, we are complaining about 5, 6, and even at 1.7% interest. They're looking at 16% interest rates. I cannot even imagine what that would look like. I can't imagine being a realtor in a time where I'm quoting you 15, 16% for an interest rate. I think I would just have to retire and tell you right now isn't a great time. But thankfully, I wasn't a real estate agent in the 80s. And I pray that we never get to these times again because it says, although boomers didn't have the same student loan burdens as millennials, many of them also entered the housing market during a period of high unemployment. The unemployment rate peaked at an all-time high of 10.8% in December of 1982. Obviously, this is excluding the COVID pandemic when basically the world shut down for the first time that we have seen it. Unemployment rates averaged 7% over the 1976 to 1994 period when boomers were turning 30. So a lot of this article was really based on looking at when each generation, the silent generation, the boomers, the Generation X, and then millennials, when each of those generations turned 30, which is kind of the average of when you're starting to see people buy their first home. Millennials were actually seeing, buy a little bit later. A lot of them are 35, 36. They're getting settled, renting first and then purchasing a little bit later, where a lot of the other generations were purchasing a lot earlier. The silent generation and then even boomers were buying in their 20s, 25 to 28 was more of an average that you saw them purchasing a home. And I think that's why a lot of millennials are looking and saying, well, of course they did because it was more affordable then, it was easier for them. But that's just not the case. They just had different priorities and they were taught different as to where they should be investing their money. And that's what a lot of this article was really talking about. So if we take a look here, still within each generation, there have been periods when typical mortgage burdens shot above 30% as they have done for the past 2 years, this is really not where we want to be, right? Because who had it worse? Mortgage payment as a share of income for each generation of first-time homebuyers. So the silent generation had it a little bit easier. Then if you look at the green area, the baby boomers, that is the highest by far. There were times when it actually shot over 50% of their income that they were having to apply towards purchasing a home or towards that monthly mortgage payment if they were going to be purchasing a home. So then in the 90s, that really continued on. It wasn't till about 95, 96 when we started to see things die down a little bit. Through the 90s and the 2000s, it was pretty regular. And then around that 2008 mark, we saw things come down because that's when we saw interest rates come down. 2008, it crashed. So 2009 through basically 2014, interest rates were low, trying to kind of generate that back up. And then from there on, we started to see things kind of level out until 2020, when it was absolute insanity. And then we ended up shooting right back up because obviously the feds wanted to bring things back down. They felt like spending was just getting absolutely out of control, which, let's be realistic, it was, right? So having interest rates drop so low in 2020, trying to generate, people getting back out, people going back out and purchasing homes, getting back out and shopping, getting back out, going, to eat, just trying to stimulate the economy. They dropped a lot of things trying to get that going. They just left it a little too long. And now our interest rates are back up. Right now, the Fed is talking about, dropping interest rates, although I think last week was a little bit of a surprise for some people. The unemployment is doing really well. There's actually been jobs added into the market. And so for those people that are getting those jobs, it's a great thing. For the economy, not so much, because that's just showing that the economy is still doing really strong. Now, inflation obviously is still extremely high, and that's not really curving off at all. So, I don't think that we're going to continue to see rates drop at all this year. You guys have heard me preach this, and Powell is just continuing to tell us the same thing. So let's just jump over in here and see what we can say. Best cartoons in the 80s and early 90s, they don't make them like they used to. That is for sure. My kids and I have those conversations all the time because they don't even know what Looney Tunes is. All of the good cartoons. I personally used to love Scooby-Doo. That was my one, but kids don't even know what that is. A good murder mystery. As a Gen Z, I can say the problem for us is low wages. I could definitely see that. I feel like inflation has increased so much and wages have not increased to meet inflation. Therefore, obviously, it's making everything incredibly hard, to afford and to purchase right now. If inflation, I don't think we're going to see inflation come down. I'm sorry. I just don't. I don't care what anybody says. I think that we're going to need that. The solution to this is going to be inventory of homes coming back on the market to kind of fend off the multiple offers and sellers not really wanting to have any sort of negotiations whatsoever, and wages increasing to then meet inflation where it's at. So I understand that perspective very, very much. Also, hello, Mr. Banks. Hello, Lim. I appreciate you guys' conversation in here. It's fantastic. So, looking at this again, it's really interesting to me because realistically you want to try and stay under that 30 mark if possible. Realistically, you could go up to 40%, but you really want to try under that 30 if you're following what, they say is the best time for spending, or the best, way for spending. But there were periods in the 80s where people were going up to 50% of their income spending on a mortgage. And that is just absolutely insane. If you're spending 50% of your mortgage, you don't need to be doing this. Realistically, if you're spending over 40, you don't need to be doing this. However, a lot of people didn't have a choice. There were not as many rental options. That's something that you also have to keep in mind. There were not as many rental options in the 80s as you see now, where there was, multiple apartment complexes right down the street. That is not what we were seeing in the 80s, where they were just lining the streets like they are now. I know a lot of people that were in, the 60s and 70s talked about there were no apartment options really at all unless you were in the city. You had to rent a single family home. That was expensive. So you had to look at either purchasing, or I know a lot of people actually that I talked with said that they used to have rental spaces above like car garages and things like that. Not like we know it here, like the Avalon, where you've got, retail on the main level and then these beautiful condos above. It wasn't quite like that. But again, I wasn't one that was renting or buying in the 80s. I would love if you were one of those that was renting or purchasing in the 80s. I would love to hear from you. I would love for you to drop in the chat what that looked like. If you can remember, what you purchased your home for, what you were paying rent for, what was the style, what was it like? I would love to hear those things, because doing research on this, it was very eye-opening to me, because I never even really sat back to think about the fact that there were not as many options to rent at that time. So it's just not something that I thought about. But then, what was the average cost of a home in the 80s? So one of the biggest surges in home prices occurred in the 80s. Basically, in the course of 10 years, from the start of the decade to the end of it, the average cost of a home jumped from $73,600 to $151,200. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking. I wish I could find a home for $151,000, right? But for it to jump that much in just a decade was a lot at that point. That was the largest jump that we had seen ever at that point. Now, obviously, over the last couple of years, we've seen a similar jump in just such a very short time. And I think that's why you hear so many people talking about why where we are right now mirrors so much of the 80s, because we're just seeing kind of step in step the same thing that we saw at that time. So what caused the 1980s housing crisis and why it was so expensive? Well, same things: elevated interest rates, lack of affordability, low inventory. It literally is like I'm talking about 2023 and 2024. It mirrors the exact conversations that we consistently have on here right now. Slow sales, they're all hallmarks of the early 80s market. It said demographic changes were also similar, with a large number of people moving into the prime home buying age. Falling inflation and stabilizing mortgage rates helped the 80s market get back on track. So something that we're seeing now, where you kind of have to hope and look at history and see, okay, eventually the interest rates came back down, inflation got under control, spending got under control, and then the housing prices kind of leveled out. They didn't continue to increase at those exorbitant rates that they had seen from the beginning of the 80s to the end. And so if history repeats itself, which from what I've seen it does, I'm really hoping that within the next 2 years, we start to see that same thing play out. I feel like 10 years from now, we'll all be looking back and having this conversation of, well, it happened in the 80s and it happened in the 2020s, and now it's happening in the 2070s. But, I don't know. Hopefully, within the next couple of years, we'll start to see a little bit of a plateau. But that being said, I'm much happier with a 6.5% interest rate than a 16% interest rate, because I cannot really fathom spending a double digit at that point. Now, that being said, you have to make the decision of when you think is the right time to purchase. And that decision is completely up to you. Double digits just doesn't seem like the time. So you can look at this right here from Bankrate. It shows back in the 80s, one of the highest percents, they got up to about 16.5% right at the beginning of the 80s. And then it kind of steadily started to drop. We had another little bit of a spike in 82, and then it steadily started to drop. And then towards the end of the 80s, we had another spike, and then another spike in the early 90s. So you can see that realistically, we are at a much better place than we were at that time. So I will take these days anytime over that. We just really need to get wages up, and we need to get inventory back on the market, because I feel like right now sellers still think it's 2021 where they can just ask whatever they want to and they don't have to do any negotiations. I feel like buyers are kind of tired of it. They see, a little bit of inventory coming back, and so they want to negotiate like it's 2008. And everybody just kind of needs to give a little bit on each end. Sellers are going to have to realize that you're in a different market than we were in 2021, 2022. And it's time to be realistic with your listing prices. It's time to be realistic in um, just your negotiations, right? This is not, I had this conversation earlier this week with another realtor who, I think some real estate agents start to think that it's our job to argue the other side, and it's not. Our job is to get both parties to agree to what is beneficial to both parties, the buyer and the seller. As long as the buyer and the seller are happy at the end of the day, real estate agents, please don't make your job or mine harder by arguing a point that's your point. If you're representing the seller and they're okay with it, let it go. If you're representing the buyer and they're happy with it, let it go. Because it's not your job to just argue the point for no apparent reason just because you feel that point. That's not helping either side. So buyers and sellers, if we could all come together and remember that the seller's wanting to sell their house, you're wanting to buy that home. And if you are both willing to have a little coming to Jesus meeting, do a little give and take. I'm not saying you have to give, everything, but you have to look at this as a negotiation, and don't get bent out of shape about things. Always put forward what you think is your best foot. And if there's something that you're willing to give on because something else is more important to you, say that, put that out there. Because I've always said, with a seller, they may not need as much money because they want time after closing. That's something that you can give and take on. This is supposed to be a partnership to get to the end with both parties being happy and in a good place. And so looking at this today, really realizing that, boomers did not have it that much easier. Yes, things were different at that time, and homes compared to what they are today appear more affordable. However, for where wages were at that time, for where interest rates were at that time, for where unemployment was at that time, boomers truly had it really, really difficult. And I think we should all take a pause and be a little bit more open-minded to where we are versus where they were. So stop talking about the boomers, and of course they are where they are today because of, what they had then. They worked their butts off for what they had then, and that's why they are where they are today. So if that pissed you off, I'm really sorry. Let's take a look at our comments. Between higher student loans, higher cost of goods, 2008 recession, COVID recession, the dollar pain for millennials is real. That is absolutely true, Anthony. And that was one of the things that was in one of the other studies talking about the higher student loan debts. Cost of goods is definitely different, but at that time there was high unemployment as well. And right now our our unemployment rates are definitely lower. So with the COVID recession, that is definitely something to be considered because a lot of people lost their job during that time. But higher student loan debts, that's a choice. That's a choice that everyone is making. I won't go down that path, but a lot of new apartments are springing up, but mostly they're luxury apartments. It's classic. That's definitely how it is here. I don't know if you guys watched a couple weeks ago when I was talking about apartments. I actually wanted to see, because I do have some people moving here where they want to rent first. They want to explore and see in person. They've watched the videos, they've watched everything on YouTube, but on YouTube and in person is very, very different. So they got here, they're renting, but for a one bedroom basic apartment, you're looking at around $1,600 a month or more. For a two-bedroom apartment, if you're coming here with kids, anything like that, a two-bedroom, you're looking at about $2,400 to $2,500 a month. That is substantial when you're looking at an apartment. That basically is a mortgage payment. So that's why a lot of people are just choosing, it's not worth renting anymore when you're looking at these apartments. And that's really what we see popping up. Jeremy and Yari turning in from Florida. Good to see you guys. Y'all are going to be my neighbors soon, and I'm so excited. You guys, they're making the move to Georgia from Florida. So were folks paying higher house payments back then relative to their incomes? Absolutely. So if you think about back in the 80s, some people were literally paying about 50% of their income, in the early 80s, when inflation was really high, unemployment was really high, and you had those 16, 17, almost 18%. I think that the highest that I saw was 18.62 for an interest rate. Those people that were buying at that time got up to where they were paying 50% of their income into their mortgage alone. So some of these people, I mean, it was penny scraping. And so, yes, I'm not going to say that people don't do that now, but dollar for dollar, it was much harder at that time, even though, it was different. Yes, it was quote unquote more affordable to us, but dollar for dollar, it was actually harder at that time than it is now. So I hope this kind of helps you guys think about things. I hope that it kind of puts things into perspective. Not saying that right now is a cakewalk by any means. Please don't get it twisted. Inflation is out of control. I really am hopeful that the next couple of years we'll see interest rates come down a little bit. I don't think we'll ever see them back in the threes unless we have another situation that happened like COVID, which I'm praying that doesn't happen. I think if we could get really in the fives, that's a comfortable place for Powell. That's a comfortable place for us as, the consumer. So I'm hopeful that in 2025, we can really start to see them just get under that 6 mark. And I think that will really be a sweet spot, bringing sellers back to the table with inventory and bringing buyers back to the market because they're feeling like they can afford something at that price. Because the difference between a 5.5% rate and a 7% rate and what you can afford each month is substantial. I appreciate you guys tuning in tonight. I can't wait to see you next week. I'll see you then.